It's time for me to begin. Welcome to this colloquia on the objects of our desires, dignifying human relationships. My name is Father Terry Ehrman. I'm an assistant teaching professor in the theology department here at Notre Dame and also the chaplain to the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. And it's my pleasure to introduce our four speakers today. So I'll introduce each, and then they'll go in order of how they're seated here at the podium. Our first speaker is Reverend Michael Baggett, who is currently the assistant professor of bioethics at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum, an adjunct professor of theology at the Christendom College of Rome program. And he's also an associate researcher at the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights in Rome, Italy. And he'll be speaking on procreative beneficence's disregard for dignity in the pursuit of an improved humanity. Next is Melissa Moschella. She's at the Catholic University of America, my alma mater for my doctorate, so it's good to have a fellow cardinal here. She's associate professor of philosophy at Catholic U, where her teaching and research focuses on natural law, biomedical ethics, and the moral and political status of the family, and has published with Cambridge Press the book, To Whom Do We Belong? To Whom Do Children Belong? Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy. And her talk is Sexual Expressionism, Reproductive Technologies, and the Objectification of Women and Children. Our third speaker is Caitlin Dwyer, proud alumna of this university, as am I. She's been teaching at the Thomas More College since 2015 and also works as a freelance editor and writer. And she'll be speaking on contraception, a continuing threat to the health and dignity of women. And our final speaker, our cleanup hitter, is Mark Cherry from St. Edward's University, which is another school founded by Father Edward Sorin, who founded this university. So it's another Holy Cross institution in the United States. Mark is the Dr. Patricia A. Hayes Professor in Applied Ethics and Professor of Philosophy at St. Edward's. His research encompasses ethics and bioethics together with social and political philosophy. And he'll be speaking on why Christianity and the secular world have so little in common: human dignity and sex robots. Very enticing. So I welcome to the podium Father Michael Baggett.
Well, I hope my talk today is at least as exciting as the notion of sex robots, but we'll see. In today's talk, I would like to explore how the principle of procreative beneficence, made famous by Julian Savulescu, is a concrete example of how we are already experiencing the practical implications of a transhumanist push for radical enhancement through a new eugenics. To assess the movement, I contend that we need to understand the trends of thought, the traditions of thought that undergird the anthropology of this principle. I propose that we apply a tradition-constituted inquiry approach to see how the advocates of this principle fail, according to the standards of their own intellectual traditions, to achieve their praiseworthy values or goals. IVF technology has often been celebrated as a means for suffering couples to achieve the children of their desire. Yet it is important to consider how such technology profoundly shapes parental attitudes to offspring. The conjugal act of love between spouses, while it may give rise to a child, is not reduced to a mere means to the end of offspring production. The mutual self-giving of the act maintains its meaning even when a child does not arise. However, in the case of a process like in vitro fertilization, it's a means whose value depends wholly upon the successful production of a product. Procreation through the conjugal act inclines parents to receive children with gratitude as distinct individuals outside of their complete control. In contrast, parents who pursue means like in vitro fertilization are apt to interact with their offspring as objects under dominion. Parents are more likely to value children conditionally according to the quality of the purchased product. With such a posture before future generations, parents are already well disposed to take more advantage of genetic tools to exercise an even greater power over the young products of their desire. Now, the most coveted offspring traits today are polygenetic and depend upon environmental factors. Therefore, people like Stanford scientist Hank Greeley, pictured here, acknowledge that designer babies are not really within our reach, even with developments of CRISPR technology. However, we need not wait for a science fiction future to exercise a greater control over the next generation. Greeley notes that IVF and embryo selection already give couples a much greater control over the children they produce and gives them a greater likelihood of having children with desirable traits. He advocates famously that the future of reproduction entails the end of sex. It's not really a very romantic proposition, but that's his perspective. We see already this shift, this tendency to move from the children of desire to the children as desired. A few years ago, John Legend, the singer, and his wife Chrissy announced that they would use IVF technology and would also employ sex selection. And of course, we already know that some clinics boast of being able to choose traits like eye color. It's in this context that Julian Savulescu, professor at Oxford University, proposes his famous principle of procreative beneficence. Now, I have here the original formulation from 2001 in a highly influential article, but I'll jump right to a more recent formulation that's a bit more precise, more nuanced, from 2009. If couples or single reproducers have decided to have a child and selection is possible, then they have a significant moral reason to select the child of the possible children they could have, whose life can be expected in light of relevant available information to go best, or at least not worse, than any of the others. So that's the principle. But again, I think that in order to appreciate what's going on here, we need to see the implicit anthropology and the implicit metaphysics at work here. Nicanor Austriaco, the bioethicist, many years ago, argued that to understand better contemporary bioethics, we need to look at the influence of postmodernism, secularism, and liberalism. And in my own research into transhumanism, especially of the Oxford School, I found that these trends of thought can also help us to understand transhumanist thinkers better. So we have this postmodern suspicion of the existence of a human nature, of human ends, or of a common vision of a good life, so a celebration of the fluidity of human identity. We have the secular influence, which in this context inclines individuals to think of human life as a product of blind evolutionary forces, and certainly not as the gift of a wise creator. So in a world without a creator, cosmic orphans are much more likely to consider themselves the creators of meaning and purpose in their own lives. And finally, we have this liberal tradition, especially a tradition indebted to John Stuart Mill, which exalts human autonomy and promotes a wide range of notions of the good life. It embraces a worldview pluralism and great tolerance of different lifestyle choices. And I also think that given the radical differences of worldview between those, say, of this Oxford school of transhumanism and those of other traditions, the Catholic tradition or a broader Thomistic tradition, we need to find a different way to enter into dialogue. And I propose that MacIntyre, through his tradition-constituted inquiry approach, helps us to confront the reality of pluralism and the depth of our disagreement without succumbing to despair over the possibility of advancing a dialogue. Now, here, I want to show some of the flaws that I perceive in procreative beneficence, but I certainly do not come to say that it's wrong because the Bible tells me so, nor that it's wrong because some principle of Thomistic philosophy says so. Rather, I seek to expose the limits, the internal inconsistencies or contradictions of the principle according to the first principles and rules of evidence and inference of the traditions of postmodernism, secularism, and liberalism that inform the worldview of some of the advocates of procreative beneficence. So first, there appears to be a certain degree of ambiguity in the binding force of parents' obligation to pursue procreative beneficence. And this really emerges, most of all, in the treatment of those with disabilities. On the one hand, Savulescu acknowledges that most individuals will consider deafness a defect to be avoided through genetic selection or engineering. On the other hand, his commitment to autonomy in selecting lifestyle values at times directs him to allow for the possibility that deaf parents might want to purposely produce a deaf child who can participate in their own deaf cultural identity. Yet by the own author's account, a child rendered deaf would have a worse life than one engineered to hear. So in some of his writing, Savulescu declares that parents' decision to cause or allow through negligence defects in their children would be a form of child abuse. So it is unclear how parents are to resolve the tension between promoting their autonomously determined lifestyle values, their commitment to a liberal tradition, and the obligation to a certain form of eugenics through responsible procreative choices, which is what procreative beneficence would seem to demand. Secondly, there's a great difficulty in determining the best life in this liberal paradigm. Now, thinkers like Savulescu look to protect different philosophical visions that could inform parents in choosing the best life for their children. Savulescu mentions hedonistic, desire fulfillment, and objective list theories as among standard ethical models that could shape parents' choices. Yet, he does not indicate which criteria should guide the judgment of the best child. The ethicists insist that procreative beneficence maintains moral neutrality regarding which model parents should use. Nonetheless, the same author argues that a certain common sense consensus about the relative desirability of key traits or states of life would, quote, rule out many procreative choices as grossly unreasonable, unquote. Yet, in the end, it's not clear what rights dissenting voices from this so-called mainstream common sense consensus would enjoy. Third, while advocates of procreative beneficence insist upon avoiding harm, they often neglect the tremendous damage done to many embryos that might be sacrificed in the process of choosing supposedly superior products through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Now, choosing not to protect or preserve an embryo disposed to illness or undesirable traits is justified from this perspective as a harmless act against those considered to be merely potential persons. I would say at best, thinkers of this school would be here guilty of dogmatically imposing upon society a very particular anthropological claim with important ethical implications. Therefore, it seems that this sort of assertion is inconsistent with the worldview pluralism that they espouse. Moreover, their judgment about the embryo's moral status might possibly be shown to be wrong philosophically. And if that's the case, they would also be guilty of a wanton destruction of innumerable lives. Such a sacrifice of the undesired for the desired would violate, it seems, even the most minimum of no harm perspectives from the liberal tradition. Recall, moreover, that the same tradition often resists metaphysical claims about human nature and the ethical life out of a fear that such assertions will lead to a kind of totalitarian domination of those with the truth over those without the truth who must conform. And ironically, it is precisely the transhumanist imposition of its exclusionary anthropology that leads to the ascendancy of a set of adults over the future of a set of marginalized, defenseless individuals, or at least potential persons. Fourth, the Procreative Beneficence Project raises major concerns about inequality. Genetic disease or disability would usually be considered to disqualify embryos for selection. Now, in addition to threatening prenatal lives, the vision of procreative beneficence could also offensively suggest that those individuals already born with disease or disability are excessive burdens. The procreative beneficence approach thus fosters a general discrimination against many vulnerable individuals. Moreover, cultural mentalities often shape visions of a successful life. The obligation to give children the best chance for success would ironically seem to reinforce unjust social structures. For instance, in a patriarchal society insensitive to women's rights, parents would be greatly motivated to select against female embryos to protect their would-be daughters from severe social disadvantage. It's precisely those parents who most oppose the evils of racism, sexism, homophobia, who might, according to this principle, become prime candidates to feel an obligation to avoid producing children with unjust obstacles to a successful life. The principle of procreative beneficence thus seems to be in tension with the postmodern sensitivity to structures of oppression, since its logic justifies the preservation and even the promotion of structural injustices. Fifth, the new eugenics advocated through procreative beneficence suffers, it seems, from many of the problems of older forms of eugenics that transhumanists try to distance themselves from. Proponents often present transhumanism as a form of liberal eugenics, since improvement comes through free choice rather than government imposition. The new, more benign eugenics protects individual autonomy in a way that earlier projects did not. While these transhumanists, in their newer eugenics vision, might avoid some of the egregious governmental abuses of authority found in older projects, it seems that the decisions of parents to freely eliminate prenatal offspring considered unfit is comparable to the decisions of powerful governments to eradicate some citizens deemed to be unfit. In the end, a powerful minority is still able to impose its vision of the good life upon a weak majority. Furthermore, the process of some forms of artificial reproductive technologies and accompanying pre-implantation genetic diagnosis can pose serious risk for those who are produced. Those embryos selected for implantation due to their apparent superiority have a higher likelihood of prenatal mortality. Even those selected embryos that survive the gestational period have higher risk of cancer, malformation, chromosomal anomalies, metabolic diseases, imprinting disorders, etc. There seems to be an inherent contradiction and tragic irony at the heart of this project of procreative beneficence. The project depends upon biotechnology that itself often poses serious threat to the well-being of the very child the parents seek to enhance. And I certainly don't have time to do full justice to bioconservative critics, but I would say that they have valuable insights into questions of authenticity and autonomy. For instance, Habermas often speaks of how these children are very much shaped by the desires and projects of their parents and are not able to subject the prenatal influence to the kind of critical revision that they might be able to exercise in other forms of influence that parents could exercise. But unfortunately, often these critics like Habermas depend more on, quote, emotions roused by moral sentiments, unquote, rather than an objective understanding of human nature. In his acceptance of a postmodern suspicion of a common human nature, Habermas is unfortunately not unlike many of the transhumanists he criticizes. In such an outlook, it is hard to see why the individual would want to conform his self-constructed ethics to the constraints of past notions of binary morality that limit his preference satisfaction. Absent a stable, universal, and normative human nature upon which to talk of fidelity to the self, this language seems to be empty. It's ultimately impossible to speak of authenticity to one's identity, since the very grounds for a stable identity have been removed without this metaphysical foundation. Finally, in conclusion, I would say that Savulescu's general concern for the well-being of the next generation is admirable. His principle of procreative beneficence, however, needs to be purified of the dehumanizing tendencies born from the postmodern, secular, liberal traditions that shape his anthropological assumptions. Today's reflection on the principle of procreative beneficence and its underlying anthropology shows the pressing need to engage the deeper metaphysical questions about what it means to be human and to flourish, so that all of us can achieve the improved humanity to which Savulescu and others rightly but imperfectly aspire. Thank you. It's just a little plug for an upcoming book.
And just an announcement before our next speaker comes up. For those who have followed the Dominical command to take the lower place, I invite you to come up higher. There are some spaces in the front if you're so inclined. There's 4 up here, 5, 6, 7. If you raise a hand where there's a seat available, you can take a seat if you'd like. And then also, I failed to mention that we'll have all our speakers talk, and at the end we'll have time for question and answer. Thank you.
What do the culture of sexual expressionism and reproductive technologies have in common? At first glance, they seem to be in tension with one another. Sexual expressionism seeks to free sex from its burdensome connection to children, while reproductive technologies go to great lengths to enable people to have children without sex. Yet, they are both fruits of the same tree, reflections of a culture that treats women's and unborn children's bodies, and particularly women's fertility, as objects of technical manipulation and control. This cultural attitude, in turn, rests on a failure to recognize and respect the dignity of the body, and especially the bodies of women and unborn children, as essential and intrinsic to our personhood, rather than as machines to be manipulated and controlled at will. In this presentation, I will analyze and explain how this underlying cultural objectification of women's and children's bodies is manifest in the widespread use of hormonal birth control, with abortion as a backup, to ensure sexual freedom, and in the practice of IVF as the standard medical response to infertility. I will contrast these objectifying approaches to sexuality and procreation with fertility awareness-based methods like NAPRO, and conclude by presenting the Church's vision of sexuality and human life as the antidote to these problematic cultural attitudes. First, let's consider the key tenets of the sexual expressionism that dominates our culture. Sexual expressionism, a term that I take from Helen Alvarez, holds that the freedom of consenting adults to express themselves sexually in whatever way they prefer is a fundamental human right, a core element of personal identity and dignity. Crucially, this view presumes that the right to engage in sexual activity, unburdened by commitment or by any responsibility for the natural consequence of such activity, namely children. On this view, sex could be a way of expressing love and commitment, or of seeking to have a child, if that's what you happen to want, but it need not involve any of these things. Of course, because sexual intercourse is the first stage in the process of human reproduction, the right to worry-free recreational sex requires obscuring this biological reality through hormonal birth control, with abortion available as a backup when birth control fails. Studies show that over 50% of women seeking abortions were using some form of contraception when they got pregnant. As Justice O'Connor wrote in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, quote, "For 2 decades, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail," unquote. In other words, sexual expressionism requires manipulating our bodies, particularly women's bodies, by altering them hormonally in ways that many doctors, including doctors who have no moral objections to birth control or abortion, are now recognizing to be harmful to women's physical and psychological health in both the short term and the long term. And when the woman's body manages to do what it's designed to do, despite our best efforts to manipulate it, it's presumed that we have a right to avoid taking responsibility by killing the unborn child, also doing violence to the woman's body and risking her physical and psychological health. Now, it's worth noting that the burden of achieving control of our reproductive capacities in this way falls almost entirely on women. While there have been attempts to make a male birth control pill, the trials have always been stopped because of the side effects, things like mood swings and decreased sex drive, that women on the pill have been putting up with for decades. By contrast, early versions of the female birth control pill had lethal side effects for some women. While newer versions of the pill are safer, it still increases the risk of blood clots and is labeled a Group 1 carcinogen by the WHO, among other things. But such risks are deemed acceptable because avoiding pregnancy is considered a health benefit to the woman, thus treating pregnancy as if it were a disease. By contrast, even relatively mild side effects of male birth control are deemed unacceptable because there is no health benefit to the man. So much for calling on men to bear their fair share of responsibility, despite the fact that it tends to be men more than women who desire uncommitted sexual encounters. As Leah Fessler points out in an insightful article on the hookup culture at Middlebury College, for women, sexual encounters outside of committed relationships are dehumanizing and often not even pleasant. She and her friends, she says, quote, were desperate to know what it felt like to be wanted, desperate for a chance at intimacy, unquote. The men with whom they were hooking up, however, quote, wouldn't even eat breakfast with us the next morning, unquote. Months after they had stopped hooking up, one of the men even told Leah, quote, I didn't think of you as a human being while we were hooking up, unquote. This points to an important but often overlooked reality that Erica Bakayaki calls sexual asymmetry, and go to her talk if you want to hear all about that. Now, while ultimately I believe that neither men nor women actually benefit from uncommitted sexual encounters, indeed, the research of Fessler and others indicates that neither men nor women are happy with the hookup culture. Still, the physical and psychological risks of uncommitted sex are much higher for women than for men. The woman is the one who has to deal with the side effects of birth control. She's the one who has to make the heart-wrenching decision of whether or not to abort if birth control fails. And she's the one who has to deal either with the physical and psychological consequences of abortion or with the responsibilities of parenthood. In addition to manipulating women's reproductive and sexual capacities so that it's possible, at least for men, to have uncommitted sex without bearing the associated burdens or risks, sexual expressionism also treats a woman's fertility as something extrinsic to her overall personal reality, as if it were a machine that could be turned on and off, depending on whether or not children are wanted. The reality, however, is that being on the pill for years often masks or causes hormonal problems that make it difficult for women to conceive or sustain a pregnancy after they stop taking it. And when this happens, rather than trying to understand and treat the underlying problems contributing to infertility, the standard medical approach generally settles for a relatively superficial investigation of the cause, and then recommends another technological workaround in which the woman's body is manipulated yet again in order to conceive via IVF. IVF involves a number of health risks for women, including the risks of hyperstimulation of the ovaries to produce multiple eggs in one cycle. And it instrumentalizes her body for its reproductive capacity, performing interventions that are risky and that don't actually aim to restore her health. The failure to respect the dignity of the child in IVF is even more stark than the failure to respect the dignity of the woman. Children conceived through IVF are subjected to the logic of manufacture and production, in which efficiency and customer satisfaction are the paramount values, as we also heard in the previous talk. For the sake of efficiency, IVF is usually done in a way that attempts to produce multiple embryos at once. Those embryos are then subjected to quality control screening, in which embryologists rank the embryos, grade A, B, C, etc., according to a system selecting the healthiest for transfer to the woman's uterus, discarding low-quality embryos, and cryopreserving any additional high-quality embryos. The fate of these frozen embryos, of which there are over 1 million in the United States alone, is uncertain. Most remain in cryostorage indefinitely. The quality control element is intensified when genetic testing is done to select embryos on the basis of the presence or absence of certain traits or diseases, as we heard in the previous talk. Now, while IVF could be done using only 1 or 2 eggs per cycle and transferring all embryos produced to the uterus, thus avoiding the problem of what to do with excess embryos and minimizing the eugenic quality control aspect of the process, as well as lowering the risk to the woman, the logic of efficiency almost always trumps these considerations about respecting the value of embryonic human life and the dignity of the woman's body. This attitude toward the child as a product manufactured to satisfy the desires of the would-be parent or parents is also seen in the practice of what's euphemistically called selective reduction. Sometimes when an unwanted multiple fetus pregnancy occurs, often because more than one embryo was transferred in order to increase the likelihood of success, 1 or more of the excess fetuses are aborted. A 2011 New York Times article discussing this practice presents the story of a woman named Jenny, who became pregnant with twins as a result of IVF and chose to abort one of them. Jenny's reflections are revealing. She says, "If I had conceived these twins naturally, I wouldn't have reduced this pregnancy because you feel like if there's a natural order, then you don't want to disturb it. But we created this child in such an artificial manner, in a test tube, choosing an egg donor, having the embryo placed in me, and somehow making a decision about how many to carry seemed to be just another choice. The pregnancy was all so consumerish to begin with, this became yet another thing we could control. That last line, this became yet another thing we could control, really captures the core of the prevalent cultural attitudes surrounding human sexuality and procreation, which is the presumption that we can and should have complete control over our reproductive and sexual capacities by manipulating those capacities at will to suit our own preferences and desires. And this can only be done by treating the human body, particularly the bodies of women and nascent human beings, as objects of technical manipulation, rather than as an essential aspect of the human person that deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. There is, however, an alternative approach to sexuality that respects the dignity of the body as an intrinsic aspect of the human person, an approach that contrasts with sexual expressionism's claim that sex has no inherent meaning or purpose. This alternative approach, based on natural law, recognizes that sex does have an inherent meaning, and that meaning is marriage, a uniquely all-encompassing union of persons inherently oriented toward procreation and family life. The ability to literally become one flesh with another human being by joining the two halves of the human reproductive system in sexual intercourse is the biological foundation of the marital community, a community that differs in kind, not just degree, from all other forms of human community, because it's a unity of persons not only at the level of mind and heart, but also literally at the level of the body. And because this bodily unity is possible only through joining the two halves of the reproductive system, it's also the kind of community that's inherently oriented to procreation. Sexual intercourse is thus literally the embodiment of the marital community, the actualization and expression of marital commitment. Engaging in sexual intercourse when there is no marital community to embody, therefore fails to respect the inherent meaning of one's bodily action and involves a kind of alienation from one's bodily self, in which one treats the body as a subpersonal object for the achievement of pleasure in isolation from any genuine human good. It also fails to respect the children that might result from one's sexual union, because it risks bringing children into the world who will not receive the united love and care of their parents within a stable family. This alternative approach to sexuality goes hand in hand with an alternative approach to fertility, which calls for regulation of fertility or healing of infertility in ways that fully respect the bodies of women and children, precisely by respecting the inherent connection among sex, marriage, and procreation. There are fertility awareness-based methods, like NAPRO, natural procreative technologies, that help couples either avoid or achieve pregnancy by understanding and working with the woman's body, rather than manipulating it. Such approaches are gaining popularity even among those who disagree with the church's teachings on sexuality, simply because it makes it possible to regulate fertility without taking health-disrupting hormones. Instead, one can avoid pregnancy by tracking one's cycle, noting the presence of certain biomarkers that indicate the approach of ovulation, and avoiding sexual activity within one's fertile window. Tracking one's cycle in this way, paired with other minor tests, also provides crucial information to help identify and remedy the underlying causes of infertility in couples struggling to conceive or sustain a pregnancy. This approach is far more effective than IVF, enabling 70% of infertile couples to have a child within a year, by contrast with IVF's 30% success rate. And it heals the underlying causes of infertility, enabling couples to conceive naturally and respecting the dignity of women and children. Yet unfortunately, standard medical training is woefully inadequate in this regard, because the standard model views women's fertility more as a quasi-disease to be manipulated and controlled, rather than as an important aspect of women's health to be understood and respected. I heard one doctor say that in an introductory 1-hour session to NAPRO, she learned more about the women's cycle and fertility than she did in all of her years of medical training, and this was an OBGYN. In sum, both sexual expressionism and reproductive technologies are symptoms of the problematic cultural presumption that we can and should have complete control over our sexual capacities through technological manipulation. This cultural presumption is in stark contrast to the church's vision of sexuality and of human life more broadly, a vision in which we're called to recognize that, although we should make reasonable efforts to plan our lives, including our childbearing, responsibly, we need to do so in ways that respect the moral law, which protects the profound and intrinsic dignity of every human person understood as a unity of body and soul. The Church's vision calls us to respect our bodies and their procreative capacities, rather than treating them as sexual objects or reproductive machines. The Church's vision also calls us to recognize that children are gifts to whom no one has a right, but rather who deserve our unconditional love and care, even when their arrival is unplanned. The ultimate antidote to a culture that objectifies women's and children's bodies is to live with a vocational sense of life, always remaining open to God's surprises, as Pope Francis exhorts us to do. Indeed, many of the most meaningful and important things in our lives are things that come unbidden, surprises that God in his providence willed or allowed to occur. The great mystery and challenge of human sexuality is that it gives rise to what is among the most wonderful and yet most terrifyingly life-altering and uncontrollable of God's surprises, namely children. This is perhaps the reason why our culture tries so hard to obscure and literally neuter that mystery. For in the end, sexual expressionism is not only or even primarily about mere sexual freedom, but is rather a matter of sustaining the illusion that we, rather than God, have ultimate sovereignty over human life. Thank you.
That was excellent. And as you'll see, there's some overlap in my talk with content, but I hope it'll serve as a nice complement to your talk, Melissa. In our culture, contraception continues to be associated with great goods for women, such as health, rights, educational opportunities, professional success, and even freedom, empowerment, and dignity. For birth control supporters, questioning artificial contraception is synonymous with questioning these goods. How could you oppose contraception, they ask. Do you want to prevent women's access to health care? Do you want to oppress women and take away their rights? But in reality, contraception poses a threat to both the health and dignity of women. Today, I will give an analysis of some of the health risks artificial contraceptives pose to women, particularly oral contraceptives, the most commonly used form of birth control. I will then explore how contraception poses a threat to the dignity of women by drawing on the writings of Pope St. John Paul II and St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. I will illustrate how contraception does not constitute good medical care in keeping with human dignity, how it reduces the sexual act from a loving act of total self-giving to an act of mutual use, and how it attacks what is most central to woman's feminine nature, her capacity for motherhood. To conclude, I will briefly share some of the latest developments in natural women's restorative healthcare, which represent a sign of hope in the pursuit of greater cultural recognition of the dignity of women. Hormonal contraceptives are widely prescribed as both birth control and as a medical therapy to address a number of gynecological conditions. However, because they are comprised of sex hormones and women have receptors for these hormones on nearly every cell of our bodies, these contraceptives affect every major bodily system from the brain to the gut. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, hormonal contraceptives are associated with a laundry list of side effects so long and so serious that one has to question whether the FDA's continued approval of these drugs is driven by ideological commitment to birth control rather than science. As Melissa noted, in 2005, the World Health Organization classified combined estrogen-progestin hormonal contraception as a Group 1 carcinogen, the most dangerous category, reserved for substances like tobacco and asbestos that are known to increase a person's risk of cancer. Hormonal contraceptives increase the risk of breast, cervical, and liver cancers. For breast cancer, the most common cancer in women, the relative risk for women taking hormonal contraceptives is 20 to 60% higher. Several of the most popular hormonal contraceptives also increase a woman's risk of developing potentially life-threatening blood clots, as Melissa noted. According to a meta-analysis conducted by the Loyola University Health System, birth control pills nearly double women's risk of stroke. Proponents of hormonal methods frequently point out that the risk is still low, but it adds up when we consider almost 100 million women are taking these drugs. A friend of mine is a nurse practitioner, and her first beating heart donor was a 21-year-old who died of a blood clot in her brain due to birth control prescribed at her university health center. These aren't just statistics. They're real women who are getting hurt. While we've known about hormonal contraceptives link with cancer and clots for a while, we are just beginning to understand how they affect the brain. While this science is in its infancy, what we know so far is eye-opening, to say the least. Sex hormones play a central role in the brain development that takes place during puberty, adolescence, and young adulthood. New research suggests that hormonal contraceptives may interrupt a critically important development process in the brains of teenage girls, causing potentially lifelong alterations to the structure and functions of areas of the female brain that control mood, cognition, and behavior. Normally, cognitive function progresses from the immature impulsiveness of adolescence to the mature, rational decision-making of adulthood, but hormonal contraceptives can interrupt this process when taken between the ages of 15 and 19. Contraceptives have other effects on mental health and brain function for all women, regardless of age. Research psychologist Dr. Sarah Hill, who I should note is a staunch proponent of birth control, reviews this research in her fascinating book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. Hill goes so far as to say that birth control changes the version of yourself that you are as a woman. One of the many reasons for this is contraception's disruption to a woman's hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which can, in Hill's words, quote, wreak havoc on your brain, your moods, and your immune system, and may even sap you of your joy of life, close quote. It can affect women's ability to learn, form memories, solve problems, and deal with anxiety. This may result in depression or far worse. Some studies suggest that artificial birth control significantly increases a woman's risk of suicide. This is in no way a complete list of the side effects that we know, and there are probably more that we do not know yet because of the disincentives in the scientific community to study women in general and contraception in particular. But it is enough to give a sense of the threat it poses to the physical and mental health of women. I will now turn to a discussion of 3 ways that contraception poses a threat to the dignity of women. The foundation of the unique identity and dignity of the human person is the fact that we are made in God's image and likeness. Humans are the only living beings on earth whom God relates to as a father relates to sons and daughters. This intimate bond with our Creator gives us what John Paul II speaks of as a sublime dignity that characterizes human nature. Based on our review of the deleterious side effects of contraception, we can see that it violates the dignity of the human person and that it does not constitute good medical care, one of the basic rights that flows from our dignity. Many doctors will argue to the contrary, pointing out that despite the risks, contraception is safer than pregnancy, particularly unplanned pregnancy. They will also argue that hormonal contraceptives constitute best practice for the treatment of many gynecological ailments. And they say this in good faith, as this is in accord with the training they receive in medical school. However, this viewpoint fails to take into account that their training is influenced by ideology. Casual sex is taken to be a good and a given that medicine needs to accommodate. The other emotionally and physically safer ways to avoid untimely pregnancy, abstinence before marriage, and fertility awareness-based methods of family planning in marriage are considered unrealistic ideals. Women's advancement and self-realization are taken to be integrally tied to the delay of children, and the achievement of this through contraceptives and abortion is understood to be an integral part of women's health care. Medicine is full of cost-benefit analysis, and the benefit of pregnancy prevention is seen to outweigh just about any cost. This ideological commitment to contraception has led to a blind spot in research in medicine, preventing in-depth research into possible downsides out of fear that such revelations could set back the clock for women. Further, considering women's fertility to be a problem to be overcome rather than a sacred gift to be reverenced and preserved has led to a lack of curiosity and creativity in the face of gynecological issues. Hormonal contraception is a cheap, easy, one-size-fits-all way to deal with the symptoms of gynecological disorders and the so-called added benefit of avoiding pregnancy. Why dig deeper? Aren't these effects a small price to pay for quick treatment and somewhat reliable baby prevention? Unfortunately, hormonal contraceptives do not even resolve most of the illnesses they are prescribed for, as Melissa noted. Rather than treating the reproductive system, they essentially shut it down, masking rather than healing women's gynecological ailments. Unsurprisingly, when hormonal contraceptives are stopped, these ailments often reappear. Surely it is not in keeping with the sublime dignity of the human person to prescribe therapies with dangerous side effects that do not actually resolve a person's illness, especially when better alternatives exist. More on that later. The second reason that contraception violates the dignity of women is that it reduces the person into what John Paul II calls an object of manipulation. Because of the sublime dignity of the human person, the proper response to a human being is love. The sexual act is intended to be the expression of married love, but with contraception, it can quickly devolve from an act of total mutual self-giving into an act of mutual use. Rather than encouraging men and women to look upon each other as life partners with whom they could share the permanent bond of children who they would work together to protect and nurture, contraception tempts us to view each other as vehicles of short-term sexual pleasure. While contraception opens up the possibility of use of both men and women, it's no secret that women tend to bear the brunt of the physical and emotional costs of contraception's degradation of the sexual act. Women are more likely to feel pressured into sex they don't want, to experience regret, anxiety, and depression related to casual sex, and to bear the effects of the 26 million or so sexually transmitted infections that are contracted each year in the US alone. Even more injurious, contraception, along with pornography, encourages men to look at women exclusively in terms of their sexual value, which is surely connected with the rise in sexual assault. Whereas abstinence and natural methods of family planning push a man to integrate his passions and virtuously sacrifice his immediate desires out of reverence for the whole woman, including her capacity for motherhood, contraception strips her of this capacity for the sake of meeting man's immediate desires, propagating the subjugation of woman introduced by the fall. This leads to a discussion of a third reason contraception threatens the dignity of women. It attacks what is most central to her feminine nature, her capacity for motherhood. While men and women are equal in their humanity and dignity, they are also different, complementary ways of being a person. St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross wrote that women's nature is determined by her original vocation of spouse and mother. The body of woman is fashioned to be one flesh with another and to nurse new human life in itself. Woman's soul is fashioned to be a shelter in which other souls may unfold. In short, women are made to bond and to mother physically and or spiritually, depending on a woman's particular vocation. This capacity characterizes what John Paul II describes as our unique genius, our special ability to recognize, nurture, and defend the dignity of every human person, even the poor, weak, and marginalized. As I alluded to in the discussion of contraception as poor medical care, birth control devalues and attacks motherhood, encouraging women to perceive their maternal nature as a problem to be overcome or at least put off while they accomplish more valuable tasks. Motherhood becomes an impediment to self-realization, an outcome to be feared rather than a path to the good life. It becomes an optional pursuit to go for if you want to and if it fits in with your career choices rather than an integral part of woman's nature and vocation. Contraception's dissociation of women from motherhood and nurturing may even manifest on a hormonal level. Oxytocin is a hormone that plays a key role in bonding. Research indicates that pill-taking women do not experience normal biological responses to oxytocin, and this may impede their connection with their sexual partners. Because oxytocin also plays a role in women's responsiveness to their babies, Dr. Sarah Hill suggests that the pill could very likely impair a woman's ability to connect with her child and increase her likelihood of postpartum depression if taken too soon after giving birth. Contraception's denigration of motherhood has paved the way for other attacks on women's fertility. For example, we are witnessing the growth of an increasingly cavalier attitude toward the serious side effects of gender transition therapies like puberty blockers, testosterone, and top surgeries in the medical community and beyond. Abigail Schreier describes the effects of these therapies in her book, Irreversible Damage, which analyzes the uptick in the number of teen girls suddenly identifying as trans who have had no previous gender dysphoria. Many in the medical community are encouraging quick transition, requiring little sustained reflection from their patients. In some places, girls as young as 15 can get testosterone on a first visit without their parents' knowledge, no referral or therapy required. This is despite the fact that testosterone, especially when preceded by a course of puberty blockers, can render a girl permanently sterile. Top surgery, the removal of a woman's breast, obviously eliminates her capacity to nurse an infant. How is this related to contraception? Contraception set the precedent that fertility and motherhood take a back seat in the pursuit of self-realization, and that hormones can be used to advance ideology in the name of healthcare, even in very young women, and even if it involves serious side effects. Research into these side effects is discouraged as people worry that focusing on the negative will call the ideology into question. Despite the many ways that contraception poses a threat to the dignity of women, there is reason for hope. More people are questioning whether the pill is really the panacea it's made out to be. Even staunch advocates of birth control like Dr. Hill are calling for further research into how contraceptives affect women, encouraging women to ask more questions and to be more educated about the possible implications of using birth control. As Melissa noted, pioneers in medicine around the world are working to create a new model of women's health care, natural women's restorative health care, which treats ovulation as a sign of health to be supported rather than a problem to be overcome or recklessly tampered with in the name of ideology. Researchers are developing innovative diagnostic procedures and therapies that actually identify and resolve the roots of women's gynecological problems. This model does not halt the reproductive system, but heals it, and not just for women to achieve pregnancy, but to achieve health and well-being. Perhaps most notable among these trailblazers is Chilean Dr. Pilar Vigil. Her organization, FEM, Fertility, Education, and Medical Management, empowers healthcare providers and women to better diagnose and treat a broad range of hormonal health issues. And she is leading the charge for global collaboration amongst physicians doing this work through the International Institute of Restorative Reproductive Methods. Using charts of their cycles as a basis for testing and diagnosis, girls as young as 14 are being treated for endometriosis, potentially avoiding decades of physical pain and the heartache of infertility should they pursue the vocation of physical motherhood. Women presenting with irregular bleeding patterns, PMS, fatigue, and headaches are being diagnosed with prolactin disorders, thyroid dysfunction, and insulin resistance. Treatment often restores not only normal ovulation, but the feeling of being one's true self. While we have a long way to go on the journey towards a cultural recognition and appreciation of the dignity of women in the secular world, an honest reckoning with the deleterious effects of contraceptives and the promise of alternatives is a good starting point for dialogue and a building of consensus that women deserve better in healthcare and beyond. Thank you.
Y'all, it's a great joy to see you all here. I hope it is not a disappointment, but I did not bring slides. Human dignity is often proposed as the basis of an ethics that possesses universal relevance, perhaps one of the few values that competing philosophical, religious, and cultural perspectives share, which can serve as a rudder leading society towards common moral ground. This presentation utilizes the example of the development of human-like sex robots with advanced artificial intelligence to illustrate why such hope is in vain. And this is not some sci-fi fantasy, this is actually in process. Sex matters. How men and women understand their bodies, regard sex, and bond sexually substantially shapes the life world. Sex is one of the major forces that influences society and its background taken for granted norms. The Western world is currently undergoing a major cultural shift. It is moving from being at least nominally Christian to becoming fully post-Christian. This newly dominant secular culture discounts all claims to a uniquely true canonical account of moral rationality and human flourishing. Everything is approached as if all were without ultimate meaning. All claims to moral truth are being deflated, reduced to socially and historically conditioned judgments, culturally relative virtues, or mere personal intuitions. For example, the marriage of husband and wife and the creation of a family is no longer recognized as the uniquely appropriate expression of sexual desire and the proper social union for procreating and raising children. Indeed, the openness with which extramarital sex is practiced, culturally embraced, and routinely celebrated is revealing of a significant shift in social sensitivities and taken for granted moral assumptions. So how should we think about the morality of sex robots and their implications for society? To secure moral claims about sexual activity with artificial humanoids, one will need to first understand what the meaning of the morality of sexual activity can be, as well as the significance of these practices on such cardinal social institutions as the family. In terms of which ranking of human goods, right-making conditions, social outcomes, or personal virtues ought we to evaluate the significance of sexual relations with robots that look like women, men, and children? Critics argue that sex robots present a clear risk to real persons as well as a degradation of society. Others judge such manufactured sexual companionship as just another step in robotic development, artificial intelligence, and the exploration of human desire. Some appreciate sex robots as a social evil, others as a more or less harmless pastime. Providing a definitive response here requires identifying a canonical perspective from which to judge competing moral accounts regarding the use of robots for sexual activity. The epistemic challenges of such a project, however, are significant. Even in principle, to talk about the possibility of a binding morally normative account of the permissibility of sexual relations with robots requires at least the philosophical equivalent of a God's eye perspective. That is to say, the regulative idea of an unconditioned perspective on reality. Here, reference to God and a God's eye perspective allows one to conceive of a perspective on reality that is not already socially, historically, or culturally conditioned. That is to say, reality as God himself knows it to be. Reference to such a perspective allows one heuristically to think of an ideal structure, constitution, and moral functioning of society and of the place of such robots within it. If such a regulative idea is abandoned, even as an in principle epistemological position, the character of moral claims are radically reclassed and deflated. Appeal to God, or at least to a unique God's eye perspective on reality and the morality such a perspective would secure. Without such a perspective, human beings are trapped always within their own phenomenological experience of the world, including their own experience of moral reality. As a result, all moral claims then would be set within your own intuitions, cultural perspectives, or political objectives. That is to say, without the ability to appeal to unconditioned moral meaning, there can be no moral truth per se. God, or a God's eye perspective, is necessary to ground a canonical position for understanding morality and why one ought to follow through on moral claims. So, as an example, traditional religions such as the Orthodox Christian appreciate particular understandings of the family as properly shaping the moral life world. That is, as embodying a morally regulative category of social life, rather than as merely historically or culturally conditioned social conventions. Traditional Christians recognize the family as grounded in a particular experience of God and endorse sex and age-specific categories of individual and familial authority and social roles. Here, there is a discourse of the roots of life, of morality, and the family with God that is understood to be the proper life of the believer. The family is experienced as a result as a normative form of social being that expresses elements of proper human flourishing as appropriately embodying social reality as it should be. Properly lived, family life orients husband, wife, and children towards appropriate lifestyles and forms of the human good, including understandings of proper sexual activities. So understood, the family exists as a foundational element of our experience of the ways in which men and women come together to procreate, raise children, care for the elderly, create social and economic capital, and realize human flourishing. The traditional Orthodox Christian family is heterosexist. It affirms all sexual activity is properly located within the monogamous marriage of husband and wife. The union of husband and wife provides for the uniquely appropriate expression of sexual desire, as well as the proper social unit for the raising of children. As a result, it rejects as sinful all sexual activity outside of the marriage of man and woman, including, obviously, sex robots. From such a perspective, sex with artificial humanoids can be easily and straightforwardly appreciated as a sinful and selfish giving in to one's passions, as demeaning to those who make use of such activities, as well as destructive to family and culture. Here, appeal to God allows one better to appreciate why the use of such robots is seriously misdirected, to mainstream them into the life world of a culture, to encourage persons physically to unite with and perhaps to love such machines, is further to isolate individuals from the rich physical and social aspects of traditional marriage and the duties of family life. It would not affirm human dignity as traditional Christians might understand such a concept. Outside of such traditional accounts and their experience of God, how would one think about the moral permissibility of sex robots or their cultural implications? The foundational challenge facing such a question is that, as always, there are deep divisions amongst various possible competing and incommensurable moral perspectives. For example, significant moral controversy exists regarding when sex is required, permissible, or forbidden. Outside of particular contentful moral communities, such as one finds within traditional religions, there is little agreement about the meaning of sex or its purpose. Such moral pluralism is not new. The difference today, however, is that the now dominant intellectual culture of the West actively shuns any appeal to God or any other transcendent moral point of view. It seeks to frame its understanding of reality and morality without any reference whatsoever to any foundation outside of particular human concerns. Having rejected God and his knowledge of reality, the epistemic role that such a perspective would play is now gone. One response to such pluralism has simply to assign cardinal moral value to individual liberty, conceptualized as personal autonomy. Severed from any transcendent account of moral truth, persons are to choose to be an autonomous and self-determining individual, someone who shapes their moral values, their perceptions of the good for themselves. Individual autonomy is highlighted in this worldview as integral to human flourishing and human dignity. One consequence of such a focus on autonomy has been the deflation and demoralization of the significance of sexual activity. This worldview is characterized by an assumption against any moral norm which would require chastity outside of the marriage of man and woman. After all, without knowledge of God and his will, how could you know that sexual activity outside of the marriage of husband and wife was inappropriate? Sexual relationships and activities have come to be based on personal attraction, the pursuit of pleasure, self-satisfaction, all separated from the biological norms of reproduction. Sexual experimentation has indeed become the taken for granted social norm. For those who live embedded within this cultural milieu, there's to cease to be any meaningful context through which to differentiate appropriate sexual relationships aside from personal interest and the consent of the involved parties. Differences in preferred sexual preferences are, according to this sexual culture, to be appreciated as morally neutral lifestyles, provided they're consensual and affirm the dignity of the parties involved, however those parties themselves understand the dignity claim. As a result, sex robots are just one more step along this continuum, allowing individuals to explore and develop their own personal interests and identity. The lexicon has recently added the term digisexuality to our way of talking about the world. This dominant secular culture seeks to place consensual sexual acts beyond moral judgment, of which sex robots just provide one more example, but also additionally isolating individuals from the rich social connections of traditional family life. The significance of sex and the importance of marriage and family life have been radically deflated. Casual sex detached from emotional intimacy has become the cultural norm, identified with social equality and personal freedom. Again, sex robots perfectly embody this very post-traditional understanding of sex and sexuality. Men and women have been successfully taught to use each other to satisfy carnal urges. Why would they stop with persons? Proponents argue that robots, in fact, ought to be a significant role in supporting central human capacities, such as sexual intimacy, which they claim are constitutive of human dignity. Mark Howard and Robert Sparrow, for example, argue that it would be useful to program sex robots to provide a positive method for expanding one's sexual horizons, learning the Kama Sutra, improving sex with one's human partner, providing sexual socialization, avoiding negative stereotypes, affirming personal welfare, and more generally supporting autonomous personal expression. Neil MacArthur claims that robotic sex possesses both hedonic and health benefits. Nancy Jecker argues that outfitted with sufficient artificial intelligence, sex robots might learn sexual preferences, as well as various forms of stimulated sexual intimacy and intercourse. She argues that such robots would permit individuals to function sexually and to feel intimate. Such robots would support a range of central human capacities, she argues, including sexual intimacies. Societies, Jecker concludes, and here I quote, ought to make reasonable efforts to support these and other central human capacities at a floor level, end quote, for all members of society, especially the elderly and infirm. When a society omits or otherwise limits such support, including what she calls sex bots, she says, quote, this not only harms older adults, but poses threats to their dignity, end quote. Indeed, Ezio DiNucci argues that sex is a good to which there is a basic human right, and that the development of such robots would provide an important avenue to address this obligation. As a result, proponents conclude robots engineered to provide an intensely satisfying sexual experience ought to be developed and made generally available as part of social welfare entitlements, designed to support equity and inclusion, especially for those who are elderly, disfigured, shy, or for who, whatever reasons, find difficulty finding a sex partner. The failure to support such projects and affirm them as good, it is claimed, pose a threat to basic human dignity. Given the background of these competing secular moral visions and the in principle impossibility of securing through general secular reason one such vision as uniquely true, and the generally permissive attitude towards sexual activity, solo or with consenting others, there may be little of real substance that general secular reason can advance definitively to resolve these types of issues. From a general secular perspective, condemning sexual relationships with artificial beings appears to be just another social prejudice to be overcome. The point of this example of the development of robots for sexual use and companionship and their integration into culture is designed to help illustrate that this concept of human dignity has no particular content of its own. Indeed, it's not one concept. It's many concepts, which are incommensurable concepts. It's both secular and religious. As a result, to understand what human dignity means and what it requires, one must first import a particular understanding of the good life and of what actually counts as doing good. Orthodox Christianity easily recognizes the sinful impropriety of having sexual relations with a robot, together with the significant social and cultural harms associated with their proliferation. There are, however, preconditions for seeing the authentically Christian and its appreciation for the authentic dignity of mankind. One must first step fully into the Christian worldview, seeing the world as the Holy Fathers did, living, believing, and worshiping as one with traditional Christianity. Without God, moral knowledge will always be, at best, disoriented. Consequently, for the liberal secular West, matters are quite obviously very different. Without the ability to appeal to a canonical moral perspective, it's absolutely unclear that having relations with a robot is much different from many of the other ways that sexual activity has been normalized outside of the marriage of husband and wife. In terms of the secular Western liberalism, sexual fulfillment is just another avenue for individual autonomous exploration and support of what it perceives as human dignity. Y'all, thank you so much.
Thanks to our presenters for your wonderful talks. And we now have time for questions. If you have a question, please, we have a microphone here in the center aisle. There's no center aisle, this aisle over here. If you can come and line up at it and introduce your name tag name, say who you are, and then what is your, like, where you come from, what your affiliation is.
Hi, I'm Teresa Kotkamp. I'm from the University of Dallas. And I had a question for you, Mark Cherry, about something you said. You mentioned that some people see sex as a human right. So I was wondering what connection, if any, you see between that idea and the rise in rape culture.
Oh, that's an empirical question to which I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry. It might be, Michelle, you mentioned something of this in your talk. Do you have insight into the connection between thinking of sex as a human right and rape, the advance of rape culture? I thought you mentioned it, didn't you?
I mean, you mentioned it.
Oh, was it Caitlin?
Yeah, I mean, I could
insight
say
into it.
something briefly about it, but
I definitely did not
yeah.
mention.
You can, yeah.
Probably a connection, but it's an empirical question for which I don't know the answer. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, so there's an interest. I would point you to a great article by Angela Franks that you can find at thepublicdiscourse.com. I forget the title, but if you just Google her name on the site, you'll find it. But she's basically exploring the idea of how, in a culture that presumes that the only moral limitation, that there's no special moral significance to sex, and that there's a kind of baseline presumption that the answer to a proposal of sexual intimacy will be yes, because there's really no strong reason to say no, right? That she thinks that this is actually at the heart of the rape culture, right? Because how do you make it really clear that you actually don't want it, right? Or that you're not just sort of playing a game or whatever, if the presumption is consent, in a way. How do you then make it absolutely clear that you don't want to consent? Or what about situations where people are drunk and they can't actually meaningfully consent and things like that? So yeah, her argument is that Me Too is not enough because you need a stronger kind of moral presumption that sex is only appropriate in certain well-defined contexts in order to overcome all the cultural pressures that just make sexual assault much more likely.
Yeah, I will say, I disagree with the view that sex is a basic human right in the way it's described. And a number of the people who argue that surely say, I mean, part of their argument is the way society can resolve this, because no one has any particular obligation to provide the sexual outlet, is to develop sex robots to present and give out to people so they can engage in whatever it is they're engaging in. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Stephen White. I'm a grad student at Michigan State, and my question is for Drs. Machea and Dwyer. Sorry about name mispronunciation. So I'm very sympathetic with your idea on birth control. However, a lot of it seemed to be related to these side effects of these drugs. So let's say I'm a doctor, researcher, I wave my magic wand and I come up with a pill, no side effects at all whatsoever, birth control, 100% effective. Kind of insert laundry list of things. What would your responses be? Are you okay with it then, or would you still have some criticisms?
And I will say that's one of the reasons I integrated into my talk a discussion of how the act of contraception itself violates a woman's dignity, that the side effects are an additional violation of her dignity, but it's not the primary one. I think all the issues about mutual use and then in particular use of women still stand, even if we wave our magic wands and make it all go away.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is also in the sort of very brief articulation that I gave of the natural law perspective on the meaning of sex as marriage and understanding that. And I think, you can explain this dialectically in certain ways. I mean, so the philosopher who I didn't mention, who was the proponent of the claim that sex is really just about sexual pleasure. It can have symbolic meaning or, procreative meaning if you want it to, but need not, right? The challenge to that kind of view, and he's very straightforward, he just takes this on board. He says, well, it also means that there's nothing specifically wrong about sexual assault or sexual harassment. I mean, sexual assault is wrong because it's assault, right? Rape is wrong because it's battery, but not anything specific about the sexual element, right? And sexual harassment is wrong because it's harassment, but nothing specific about the sexual. And you have to bite that bullet if you think that there's no meaning to sex. Now, the only way to explain why sexual assault is different in kind, probably worse than other forms, or sexual harassment worse in kind, is to recognize that there's actually a distinct human good at stake in the sexual realm, and that's the good of marriage. And that's what's being damaged beyond just bodily integrity and so on in other forms of violence that are non-sexual, right? And so that's the only way to actually explain why sex is special at all and why sexual wrongs and sexual violence are worse. But then with that picture, you have to understand that picture is based on the recognition that there's something real going on at the bodily level in sexual intimacy. Namely, you literally become one flesh with another person. And that's the only way that that's possible. It's not just interlocking parts, right? It's combining the two halves of the reproductive system to make a single organic unit. And how does that happen? Well, it happens because you've combined the two halves of the reproductive system, right? So the orientation to procreation is there. And when your will is contrary to that clear, sort of further meaning and fruition of your action, you're alienating yourself from some aspect of your body, and you're negating the meaning of what you're doing, right? And so denigrating your body to just an object of use, as Caitlin said. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ethan Schimler. I'm a family medicine physician down the road at Memorial Hospital. Thank you all for some very spicy papers on our cultural revolution. If I could humbly offer some charitable clarifications on behalf of the medical community about oral contraceptive pills. I think the case against oral contraception is strongest from a social and moral perspective rather than a medical perspective. It's important when you talk about oral contraception as a class 1 carcinogen, it's important to put some of the relative risks within context. So it's specifically with the risk of breast cancer. It's been well described, but proponents of birth control, and you probably just didn't have time to talk about this, always point out that
It's in a footnote. I know.
oral
I know what
contraceptives
you're gonna
reduce
say.
the risk
Yep.
of endometrial and ovarian
Yes,
cancer.
I
They
did
always
have
talk
it.
about that.
I moved it to a footnote for time.
And just
Go ahead.
in terms
Yeah.
of public health in this country, the leading, if you want to point a finger at the leading cause for the rising rates of breast cancer in this country, it's obesity, which increases the levels of estrogen in a woman's body much more than an oral contraceptive pill does. And so it's important to put some of those risks in context and to look at what else is on the class 1 carcinogen list. Processed meat, for example, is on that list. There's a whole host of things that are on that list that's important to just put it into context. Also, just with some of the psychotropic side effects of oral contraceptive pills, they're very real. Also important to put in context, I believe, is the fact that 12% of young women, according to the latest CDC data, are on some form of oral contraception. Actually, more than that, are on some form of long-acting contraception, such as an IUD, especially the progesterone-containing IUD. But SSRIs, antidepressants, are used 17% of young women. So just to put some of this in context within culture of medicine and what's really being done to to women's bodies, and medications are. We give medications for specific indications, but we think of this as for that, but it doesn't really work that way in reality. It hits the whole body, as you were talking about the side effects of oral contraception. And really any medication is that way. SSRIs are that way, statins are that way, aspirin's that way, anything is that way.
Oh, absolutely. And I think those are very important things to point out and to put things in context. I think for me too, why I do think there is still a medical critique to be made, there's the assumption that there's not healthier alternatives. And so like abstinence, for example, has 0 health risks, right? So yes, birth control compared to other medications has similar relative risk, but compared to the other options that are available that are just very quickly dismissed as that's just not realistic, that's just not going to happen, I think there is still a legitimate point to be made that medically, right, abstinence is better for women than these medications, especially at such a young age. And I think also for married couples as well, fertility awareness-based methods of family planning, they are just as effective if used correctly. And then again, you have 0 risk. So I think that is important to keep in mind as well. But you are absolutely right. All medications have effects beyond their targeted use.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that as well, that I think there are concerns about at least implicit in some contexts, view that pregnancy is a kind of lack of health for women to be avoided, right? That's part of the culture of the pill as just kind of automatically being pushed on girls, even without any medical issue, right? Even without any issues with their cycle, they go to their doctor at 16, and the doctor is probably, depends on who your doctor is, but is probably going to try to push the pill, just in case, right? Even if the girl says that she's not planning to be sexually active, and they'll downplay that there are any problems with it. They'll say, oh, and you won't have to deal with your period every month, and you won't have to, all sorts of things. And so I think that's a further problem, right? That that there's also an opportunity cost there in terms of thinking about pregnancy as a disease, and that the medical training really doesn't teach doctors, even doctors who specialize in this, about the things that you can do to fix the underlying causes, right? So I think it's problematic that doctors are not taught the things about the women's cycle that we know from all the sort of work that's being done with NAPRO, and that's actually just really important for women's health, even beyond regulation of fertility. So, but I agree that all medicines have side effects. And,
yes. To be clear, I didn't say this, but I don't actually prescribe oral contraception.
So I just want to draw
maybe I should have led with that, but
If I can just draw close to this question, since we're 5 minutes over time, I do want to get to our final two questions. If you can want to ask those, and we can then.
Good morning. Sorry, did you want to?
I just wanted to say quickly too, I think there can be a tendency to demonize the medical community that I'm not trying, neither of us are trying to do. I think this is in accord with their training, and that's part of the issue. They need better training. So I think many physicians are operating in good faith. I just wanted to make that clear. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. My name is Marcel Vandervoort. I'm from the University of Dallas. I just wanted to thank you all for your witness this morning. As a young woman, I can absolutely attest that birth control is pushed. And I'm sure every young woman in this room can agree that we have all experienced that objectification of ourselves. Having said that, how can we demand better? Of our doctors, of our families, but specifically, how can we encourage everything that you've been speaking about? How can we encourage that of other young women? Because I've seen so much the frustration and the sadness and the despair, really, of women my age who don't want to be used as sex objects, who don't want their boyfriends to watch porn all the time, who don't want to take birth control, but have really given in to maybe the indoctrination of our culture that is our only option. So my question is, how can we encourage better of our peers and really encourage them to have this view that you've been speaking about of the dignity of our bodies, especially of our reproduction?
I could say a couple of things. First, your witness is obviously the most powerful thing, right? Your friendship and your witness and your presenting an example of an alternative viewpoint, and you can do that from a variety of perspective, depending on where people are coming from. I think even just educating young women about their cycles and saying, hey, look, I've got this great fem app, you can track your cycle. It's just really helpful for understanding your body. And most women find that helpful and empowering, and they can understand, I understand why I have that mood swing now. I understand why this is going on. And perhaps, discover underlying health issues that can be remedied. For most women, just that level of self-knowledge about their bodies is really empowering, and it's completely morally neutral. Whatever perspective you come from. Mm-hmm. There are lots of, doctors from a variety of perspectives with books about this that have nothing to do with morality, but are just trying to empower women to take charge of their health. And you can bring those things to your doctor too and say, look, I have this app and I've discovered this, or I've read this book and I've discovered this. And doctors are usually receptive. It's not that they're opposed. Right. They just don't know. And then, of course, the broader thing is, I think often women feel like if I don't settle for the boyfriend who uses porn, or if I don't let him, or if I don't whatever, I'm not going to find anybody, right? And so they settle. So I think also encouraging young women to say, well, you deserve better. And there are better men out there. And I don't know, maybe you need to go online to find them, or, it's true. I mean, sometimes finding people with the same values might require going out of your immediate physical community.
But no robots.
So, but no robots, yes. So, yes, I mean, obviously at a campus like this or Dallas, I'm sure you can find men, but also challenging men to say, like, this is not acceptable. I mean, men often typically, need to be pushed to grow up, often by women. I mean, this is just often how it works, right? That this is what civilizes men, is that women require it of them, right? And so I think also just saying, well, look, like, tell your boyfriend, get off the porn or we're breaking up. And if he says no, well, he's not worthy of you. I mean, easier said than done, but yeah.
And if we could move to our final question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Dorflinger, I'm a fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture. I agree that if you treat this as a war between two incompatible worldviews, we're sunk. But I'm always looking for empirical ways of showing, this advance that you see, like sex robots, is not leading to the things you thought it was going to lead to. And I think we have already a live experiment in the thing that is just before sex robots, which is this epidemic of online pornography and solitary sex among young men. Seems to be worse in Japan. There was a BBC documentary some time back called No Sex Please We're Japanese. And it was a very large number of young male teenagers and young men. They interviewed one young Japanese man who said, women are so complicated. This is true, by the way.
In a beautiful way.
And they have their own emotions and needs and so on. And I just go online and, get all the pleasure I need. And I'm beginning to wonder if the recent decline in abortions in the United States, which is led by a decline among 15 to 17-year-olds who are engaging less in casual sex, which I initially celebrated, I wonder if they're just having sex with their laptops.
Right.
So it gives new meanings to laptop, doesn't it? But I wonder if, we need to be concentrating a good deal on the empirical evidence that these things do not lead to, for example, a better appreciation of having sexual relations with real people, but just the opposite, and undermines it. Because, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature, and sometimes that comes out. We need to be doing a lot of research on what the real world effects of these trends are. Thank you.
So, one of the challenges is that even how people evaluate the empirical data varies immensely from culture to culture, place to place, time to time. It's always seen within a particular context. So this particular short presentation actually comes out of a longer project on sex robots, which is now in a book form. Again, no illustrations. But it was an international project. I was working with a very traditional Confucian named Professor Fan, who lives in Hong Kong, and we brought together colleagues from Japan and Australia we had Taoists and Confucians and yuppie secular atheists and Americans and Texans and so forth. And what was remarkably interesting, obviously Americans and Texans are different categories. You agree, right? Okay. So what was remarkably interesting was, and you rightly point to the Japanese, these were scholars. They couldn't see what the problem was. I mean, really, they're saying, well, I suppose if one wants to, why not? The Confucians, who are more liberal Confucians, said, well, probably not good for the family, but maybe if somebody's really isolated, maybe. And the real traditional Confucians had somewhat different views than, say, us Orthodox Christians, but we all got along really well and thought this was a bad thing. And then we had sort of the yuppie secular atheists who were saying, well, why wouldn't you do this? This is good. And in fact, it's so good the government should provide it as a part of basic welfare entitlements. Now, that's Nancy Jeffers actually published that more than once, that particular argument. So it's a remarkable way in which one can't see, if you take the point, right? Even the data, as you very rightly point to, is interpreted and seen differently in different contexts. And it's remarkable. Yeah. Anyway,
I would just add that there is very good empirical work, and and anybody interested in seeing some of the empirical work, Mark Ranieris's recent book, Cheap Sex, is great on this. And he talks about how the market for dating and marriage has been skewed terribly by porn because men are basically less interested in dating and marriage because they're not being pushed to it by the need for it to fulfill their sexual desires, since they're getting that from porn. And it's also actually causing sexual dysfunction in men, because if you've been, looking at porn for years, like the normal woman who's not doing all sorts of strange things or, touched up with, the fake things that you can do in a video, like a real, flesh and blood woman is not able to then generate the level of sexual desire to actually lead a man to climax. So then you have all these men who need Viagra to be able to actually function sexually with real women after having been hyperstimulated by porn for years. So there are empirical problems that you can point to as well.
That brings a close to our session. Let's thank our speakers one more time.